You've probably seen them all over your feeds lately. Americans who have moved abroad and are painting a perfectly painted picture of the version of their new life living abroad. Look at my villa, look at my lifestyle, look how cheap everything is. But they're selling you a dream, right? A lot of times they're stripping away the context. And the Dominican Republic has become one of those places, like the biggest place where this is actually happening, where you see this kind of content. Entire channels, businesses, and influencer brands are now built around the idea of leaving the United States and starting a better life somewhere else. Now I've lived there for years. I'm established in DR, right? I'm established forever. But this isn't the only place that this happens, right? It's not only a Dominican Republic story. This is something you see anywhere. There's a big cost of living gap between countries. And this usually always looks the same, no matter if it's DR, Colombia, Brazil, anywhere in Latin America. But someone moves abroad, and then right away the country becomes a business, a product. I left the US and life is easier here. It's cheaper, it's better. You should do it too. And then the funnel follows. So right after that, the relocation guy comes, the real estate course comes, the insider community comes, the paid group teaching you how to transition smoothly, all kind of things that, people come up with when they start moving abroad and doing content. Now, before I keep going, I do want to say this. There is nothing wrong with sharing your experiences living abroad. There's nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing wrong with selling advice either. A lot of people do it. I've done it. The problem starts though when someone else's country becomes a commodity and then the reality gets edited out. That's what I'm talking about. Because that's not education. That's marketing, right? And marketing can be misleading if it's not done with context. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not anti-living abroad. I've spent years outside the United States. Living abroad can be one of the most meaningful experiences that a person can have because it truly is. It's beautiful, right? But I am pro-context because real people live in these places and real decisions get made based on the information that people put online, right? So as more Americans start thinking about leaving the United States, people deserve to understand the full set of dynamics they're stepping into. The good, the bad, and then sometimes the ugly, because it can get ugly. And one of the most common tactics that you see in this whole travel space is the US versus Dominican Republic in comparison, or Colombia, or Brazil, or Kenya, or whatever. It's framed like it's apples to apples. But what is usually being compared is a middle class life in the United States versus an upper class lifestyle inside a very small area somewhere else in another country. And those are not the same situations, right? You'll see gated communities, you'll see modern villas, you'll see private security, you'll see penthouses, you'll see imported grocery stores, you'll see high-end amenities, spaces designed for people that got money, including the local elites of whatever country that person's in. And then you hear the line that gets replaced all the time, or repeated, I should say. The media will never show this side of the Dominican Republic, or Colombia, or Brazil, etc. But that's not really true, is it? Because the media absolutely does show luxury tourism and luxury developments in these countries, especially Dominican Republic. What often doesn't get explained is how close these realities sit next to each other. For example, in Santo Domingo, you can have luxury towers in one direction And then 10 minutes in the other direction, you're in a barrio where life looks completely different, right? And most foreigners that go to Santo Domingo or go to other countries, they end up in the same cluster of neighborhoods. They all go to the same places. And those areas, they function almost like a wealth bubble. You know, you got luxury towers, people got their generators, they got their water tanks, private clinics, private security. So when someone says, this is life in Santo Domingo, this is life in DR, what they are trying to say is, this is my life inside this very small pocket of the city. And that distinction matters. People need to make sure that that context is there. But there's another piece of that story that almost never gets talked about in the move abroad influencer economy and travel space. And this is what it is. It's lifestyle trade-offs. You know, you hear a lot about how cheap everything is, but you rarely see influencers or people in the travel space living the same type of lifestyle that they had when they were in the United States. You know, take cars, for example. You know, in the US, a lot of these same creators have vehicles, sometimes very nice ones. They have BMWs, sports cars, maybe SUVs, trucks, motorcycles, you know, the kind of things that are pretty normal in American middle class life. But once they move and go overseas, the lifestyle starts to look different. You know, you see a lot more walking, you see a lot more public transportation, motoconchos, buses, Uber, InDrive, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Because there's millions of people around the world that rely on public transportation every single day. So there's nothing wrong with that. But you can't sell a dream lifestyle without telling the whole truth about the trade-offs that come with it. You know, how many relocation influencers do you see actually upgrading their lifestyle after they move abroad? How many do you see moving abroad and they move with the same level of mobility or flash that they had when they were in the United States? You know, in my own case, when I lived in the Dominican Republic, you know, I've been there for years. I had multiple cars over the years. I had one point, I even started a rental car business. You know, eventually that business failed, but I still went through the process of building it. You understand what I mean? And even with that experience, I can tell you the reality is different. In the United States, I had multiple cars too over the years. I had turbo Hondas, I had an Impala SS, I had a Camaro, I had a Cadillac. I mean, I had a lot of stuff, different vehicles at different points in my life. And that kind of consumer lifestyle is just simply easier to maintain inside the American economic system. So you don't often see influencers abroad or in the travel space moving around like that. But there's a reason for it. The economic structure and between the countries is different, right? The local wages are different. You know, import costs are different. Maintenance costs are different. All that stuff you have to factor in. But those realities, they rarely appear in the highlight reels when you're watching these videos from these influencers and the people in the travel space. And that matters because people watching these videos, they are actually making real life decisions, right? Now, let me give you a personal example about affordability. When I was living in Dominican Republic, you know, when I first moved there to Dominican Republic, I was paying about $700 a month in rent. And then I later had found me a place in San Francisco de Macorís, and my rent had dropped from $700 to about $300 a month. And then after that, I had moved to Santo Domingo because I love being in the city. And I moved into a regular neighborhood, a regular barrio, and I was paying $100 a month. And I love that. Who wouldn't? And yes, all those prices are cheaper than what a lot of people pay when they're living in the United States. But if you look at that trend that I just broke down for you, that's actually moving backwards. $700, then $300, and then moving down to $100. And the goal when people move abroad is to move forward, not to stay stagnant or start scaling down their lifestyle. But the affordability that people talk about, it exists partly because of a deeper structural issue inside the country, right? So the conversation isn't really about whether you should share your experience or even sell information. It's about whether you're telling the entire story, right, about living abroad. Because majority of the locals, they can't access the lifestyle that often gets sold to people online. And it's not because they don't work hard. It's not because the wage structure simply doesn't support it. The villa lifestyle, it exists, but for a small elite and for foreigners with foreign income. It's not the day-to-day reality for most people, for most Dominicans, Colombians, Cubans, Brazilians, whatever. The Dominican Republic, it is indeed rapidly growing under, upper middle income, as an upper middle income country. It's growing. I think it's the fastest growing in the Caribbean. But growth doesn't automatically mean equity, right? Because nearly half of the workforce operates in the informal economy, which means that there's no contract, there's no pension, there's no medical care, there's no safety net, no 401k. So while the economy has grown and luxury developments have expanded, upward movement for people, it still remains limited. I'm talking about Dominican Republic because it's not because of a lack of effort, it's because of limitations in the country. So if someone is selling you a life in another country, these are the kind of specifics that you should be asking about, So I want to talk about, Punta Cana, because Punta Cana is basically the center of tourism in Dominican Republic. It was built and engineered for consumption. You got resorts, the beaches, clubs, you got gated complexes, and many of the spaces you see online, they're private environments designed specifically for tourism and for foreign residents. And yes, Punta Cana has expanded, it has gotten bigger. There are now working class neighborhoods, there's schools, there's local businesses and families that are living throughout the area of Punta Cana. But the gated areas shown online, they operate differently from, the broader communities where workers actually live, right? And when property listings, in a peso economy start showing US dollars all the time, that tells you exactly who the target buyer is. So when someone films their lifestyle in Punta Cana and they say this is the life that you can have, what they're really showing you is life inside a very specific bubble, a very small percentage of the country. And this conversation isn't about attacking the Dominican Republic at all. It's nothing to do with that. It's a country that, I care about deeply. I'm connected to it. At this point, I have family. You know what I'm saying? And it's not about comparing the U.S. and the DR like they're competing products or something like that. It's not about that either. Every country has its strengths and its weaknesses. Every country has its own history, its own structural realities, and ignoring the difficult parts doesn't help anybody, right? Because some creators say, don't colonize my country. And then if you have your business model and it markets and a small, type of lifestyle for foreigners while ignoring the deeper conditions that actually make that bubble possible, then that's still a form of extraction or exploitation, right? Even if your ancestors had came from there. Being from a place doesn't automatically make your marketing ethical. And what's often missing from relocation funnels is just being real, just real talk. People don't want to be real, they just want to give you the good, whatever sells. The local wage levels, housing displacement, the social structure, political pressure, all those kind of things. You can't credibly sell life in a country while ignoring the forces that are shaping daily life for the people who are actually living there. So this isn't just about criticism. It's about, doing better as influencers as well. Because if you are an influencer encouraging people to move abroad, you have to show the full picture, especially people are making real life decisions about this, right? You have to question the comparisons, follow the money. I know you heard that before, follow the money. Listen to the local voices in the countries or places that you're going to. And if you're someone thinking about, moving abroad, you gotta ask yourself an important question. Are you contributing to the place that you're actually going to? Or are you only there to consume it? You know what I'm saying? That's why I wanted to do like a rental car business and offer a service. I've lived in Dominican Republic for 4 years, not 8, 4. I'm not anti-living abroad at all. I'm anti-fantasy being sold as a fact for profit, if that makes sense. Because moving abroad, like I said, it can be one of the most meaningful experiences of your life. It can be, top everything. It's a beautiful experience, but only if it's approached with honesty, humility, and awareness of the systems that you're actually stepping into. So my thing is, don't let someone else's highlight reel replace your personal research and due diligence. And don't let anyone sell you a country without showing you the full story.